Good afternoon, U.S. history. This is our third class done via YouTube. We just had our spring break. Did that feel like a spring break? And most importantly, I hope that you are well and that you are safe, that your whole family is good, and that you're, to whatever extent, able to quarantine yourselves until it is safe to go out again. All right, we're going to talk about the conditions just prior to World War II and our entry into World War II, and we're going to start it off with a quiz. Hope you enjoyed that 83 or 84 question crossword puzzle. I hope so. I enjoyed it. So here's your quiz. Get out your crossword puzzles. It's on Chapter 20, Sections 1 through 4. Quiz question number 1 is from number 6. The Russian Communist Revolution was led by this man. This is the guy who initiated it at first. Number 2 is from number 16. The economic blank caused people to support extremist political parties. So number 2 is from number 16. The economic blank caused people to support extremist parties. Number 3 is from number 28. The Neutrality Act of 1937 allowed blank, 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 or blank, blank, or blank arms sales. Number 3 is from number 28. The Neutrality Act of 1937 allowed blank arms sales. Number 4 is from number 35. European leaders agreed to Hitler's demands, a policy known as blank. Number 5 is from number 57. The ship that was never allowed to land on our shores, instead returning to Europe. Number 6 is from number 66. FDR's aim was to strengthen this nation in Europe. Number 7 is from number 75. U.S. officials thought the islands of blank were too remote for an attack. And finally, number 8, extra credit, is from number 83. FDR believed in the 4 blanks. They had to do a speech, worship, want, and fear. Okay, you got half your Google Doc. The rest are just a few questions based on this brief lecture. All right, and I got to admit, I don't know if you've been experiencing this, but my brain doesn't work as well during this pandemic as it normally does. I think it's the distraction, it's the anxiety, it's the disruption to our lives. So if I'm a little spacey or have long periods of I don't know what I was going to say, bear with me. All right. Also, I want to thank you for getting your homework in on time. Many of you did with hours remaining. So thanks for that. All right. Let's first talk about the conditions in Europe in the 20s and 30s that led to World War II. They were bad. We think we're the only ones who had the Depression. Well, the Depression was a worldwide event. The economic depression affected everyone. And nowhere was it worse than in Germany. They experienced tremendous suffering because of the Depression. Also, we've got to realize that Germany, a major country in Central Europe, Western Europe, was experiencing the shame and guilt and humiliation and outrage at the way that World War I ended. They had been blamed for the war, and in the Treaty of Versailles, they were punished very harshly by being required to pay back repayments to the nations that they had waged war against. Not only were they very unable to make full reparations during this depression, but it really affected their morale. They really had a sense of, as I said earlier, shamed. And that's how it was. Also, their military was required to be only at a certain very minimal size, and they were quite heavily controlled. As a result, we see the Depression, and for Germany especially, the shame of the Versailles Treaty. We see extremist leaders really taking advantage of a people who are scared and want great change. And those three leaders that take over at least three of the countries of Europe are in order of badness, getting with the last one the worst. Franco in Spain, Mussolini in Italy, and of course, worst of all, Adolf Hitler in Germany, gaining power as fascists, highly nationalistic, highly militaristic, very covetous of power and of increasing their not only political and military power, but increasing their empires, all three of them, but especially Hitler, as we'll see in a second, and as you saw doing your homework. Um, so we got these three leaders in Europe, also in Europe and Asia. We see in Russia, we see uh, a the system of communism, which was started by Lenin, is passed on to another leader, Stalin, who has a power struggle with a guy named Trotsky, who probably would have been a better leader and more peaceful leader, but we don't know that for sure. But anyway, Stalin was pretty darn horrible. Lenin was led by a lot of idealism with Marxist ideology. He did some bad things for sure, but Stalin was just outright evil, and he, in trying to quickly industrialize, allowed 10 million people to starve in 1 year, just to basically fulfill his aims to industrialize quickly and to militarize quickly. And then way in the east, we see Japan. Same thing, not as a communist, but like the European leaders, the fascists take over. They also, I think, as a result of the depression there may have been the worst of all. Japan is a really resource scarce nation. This little island nation that's basically populated around the coasts of mountains. They need a lot of things that they don't have, and they need to trade for them. And at no time is it worse for them than during an economic depression. So they became very aggressive, and the military basically seized control there, killed the prime minister who was trying to negotiate with China, and they took over part of China, a resource-rich Manchuria. So they were on the same track as Hitler and Mussolini and Franco in Europe. Wow, scary times. But what about U.S. history? After all, that's what we're studying. Well, on the other hand, we were looking at this from afar and saying we want no part of it. We were very much isolationist. That was our sort of mode of thinking at the time. Why were we so isolationist? Well, remember, we had just come out of World War I, and I'd say that most Americans would say World War I was a net loss for the U.S. We put in troops toward the end of the war, and we lost a lot of lives. And what did we gain? I guess our side did win, but did we really gain anything? Or did we really lose more? I think most people would say we lost more than we gained in that far-off war. We also refused to sign to join. The Congress declined to join the League of Nations, which was the pride and joy of our president, Woodrow Wilson, because we didn't want to be committed to some treaty that committed us to being engaged in foreign wars. Besides, it was a little bit unconstitutional. So we didn't sign that, and we said, enough of that, we're going to deal with our own stuff. And we were trying to deal with our own stuff, because remember, this is the time of the Depression, so we were very focused on trying to solve our own problems, which were very severe. And the way that played out in policies that affected foreign affairs were the Neutrality Acts, the three Neutrality Acts of 1935, 1936, and 1937, which basically were a way for Congress to say, and President Roosevelt signed them, that we don't want a part in these foreign wars. Not only do we not want to take part in them directly, we do not want to sell arms and armaments to these countries. Oh, one thing I didn't add. was that that thing called the Nye Committee also fed our isolationism, because it proved that many of the arms manufacturers in the United States during World War I helped influence government opinion about entrance into World War I, and those arms manufacturers made money hand over fist. So the population really felt sort of duped into World War I, and we didn't want to do that ever again. So there we are in 35, 36, and 37, and we're isolationist, and FDR feels a little bit differently. And I'm not saying the entire country was isolationist, but definitely a majority of people would have tended toward saying we should really keep ourselves from getting involved. On the other hand, Roosevelt was the opposite term of isolationism, which is an internationalist. He definitely wanted, at least, he didn't want to get involved in foreign wars, but he did want to stay connected to other countries, because he realized that a strong and prosperous nation could only be strong and prosperous if it connected with other nations, primarily through trade and through positive political foreign relations. That it would be to our detriment to just turn away from the rest of the world and not deal with it. Of course, these were unique times, because the rest of the world seemed to be going crazy and going toward war, and it didn't seem like it had anything to do with the U.S. Well, where am I? Here's one of those times when I'm going to have to sort of go, okay, where am I? All right. So, what do I talk about first? Let's talk about Hitler. Okay. Hitler and Mussolini gained power not forcefully, but they were appointed. Hitler did actually initially try to force his way into power, but again, after some time in jail and writing his Mein Kampf, where he outlined his basic theories, which were nutso and crazy and evil. But once he did gain power, he was a very shrewd negotiator. There is no doubt that he knew exactly what he was doing and what his aims were from the very beginning. But he sort of conned the rest of the world into thinking that he just wanted to unify Germany and to regain some of the land that was lost in World War I and at other times. That is a little bit in the Rhineland with France. He wanted to gain some to connect to Prussia, that is part of Poland. He definitely wanted a little part of Austria, because he wanted to reunify with Austria, because that was German land as well, German-speaking Germans. And also a portion of southeast Germany called the Sudetenland, which was currently within the territory of Czechoslovakia. Well, in the Berlin Conference and the Munich Conference and in other international meetings, he basically negotiated his way to gaining some of these territories, specifically the Sudetenland. And one of the leaders of the Allies, this would have been Neville Chamberlain of England, famously returned from the Munich conference saying, "We have achieved peace in our times." Never has a quotation gone back and slapped someone so rudely in the face as that, because not long afterward, Hitler would not only take that inch that he negotiated for, but actually, how's the phrase go? He didn't even take an inch, he took a mile. He was given an inch and he took a mile. And where did that happen? Well, you read it in your chapter. It happened in Poland. Poland had negotiated with the Allies, that is with England and France, that those two countries would come to Poland's aid if Germany tried to show aggression. And Hitler actually asked for the city of Danzig, which was in Polish territory, but would have helped him connect Germany with East Prussia, which was what he thought right German lands. But Poland refused. And they refused in part because they knew that they had other strong countries in their back. And that was the point of where Hitler said, okay, I can't just sort of bluff my way into gaining territory. I'm going to have to attack. Before he did so, though, he negotiated a non-aggression pact with Russia, because the last thing he wanted was to be at war with Russia on the other side. He wanted Russia to be in his pocket as well. So he negotiated a non-aggression pact with Russia and secretly negotiated with them to split Poland in half after he had invaded. I don't, as we know, he didn't want to split it with them. It was a temporary lie so that he could take Poland with Russia's compliance, and then he could take all of Poland and then even attack Russia. So he invaded Poland. And this is the first time where we see the lightning power of Hitler's war machine, called the Blitzkrieg, which was described very well in the chapter, involving bombings, paratroopers going behind lines, tanks, followed by infantry. Just a lightning war of all forces attacking all at once. Poland basically was taken instantaneously. Instantaneously. And that is when World War II really starts. And England and France basically go to war with Germany, and Germany declare war on them as well. In the meantime, the U.S. is sitting back and watching in horror, but trying to stay out of it. What did Roosevelt try to do? He tried to negotiate as much as he could, despite neutrality laws, to help Great Britain. And that was the nation that he really wanted to strengthen, because he saw them as a great hope for the Allies against Germany. And we'll see in a second what he did. But first I want to describe what Hitler did next. Hitler really wanted to attack Great Britain, but Great Britain was pretty isolated. After all, it is an island nation, and any transport boats could be sunk easily. So what's the only way to attack Great Britain effectively? By the air. So his air force, the Luftwaffe, basically started bombing of all over Great Britain, particularly, well, especially only military installations. Until one time they actually bombed by accident the city of London. And in retaliation, the English actually began to bomb Berlin, and that really angered Hitler to a point where he no longer bombed only military installations. He bombed only London. And I mean, you've probably seen some references to this. I mean, it's in C.S. Lewis's Narnia series. I mean, why do those kids leave London and go out to their weird uncle, isn't that who it is, in the country? It's to get out of London, where it's being bombed in the Battle of Britain. Where else do we see this? Oh, you American Girl fans. Who was it? It was Molly, right? Molly from World War II, who has her English friend named Emily, whose father is missing from the bombings in London. I don't know. You can educate me more on that. Please do so in your Google Docs. But this is the Battle of Britain. It's entirely a war in the air. And even though the Luftwaffe of the Nazis was superior in number and in training to the Royal Air Force, the Royal Air Force effectively countered and defeated the Luftwaffe. Part of the reason we did that, we could do that, they could do that, is they just sustained and took precautions to protect people during the bombings. They also had radar to protect themselves and alert themselves as to where planes were incoming. The Germans did not have this. And we also had allies. We had French and Polish and Canadian, and not so any Americans yet, also serving in the Royal Air Force. So finally, Germany calls off the Battle of Britain and ceases to try to take over Britain. One great victory for the Allies. In the meantime, isn't it time for a question? I think it's time for a question. Number one. I love it. It's going back in the video. What are 2 reasons why Germany might have felt like they needed a new, bold, pro-German leader? I know I'm asking that a little bit late, but you can go back if you don't remember. What are 2 reasons why Germany might have felt like they needed a new, bold, pro-German leader? And I can ask you number 2 right now because we've also gone over this. Number 2, give a reason why the U.S. was quite isolationist while the war was brewing in Europe. Nice. All right. Wow, and I can even ask you number 3. At what point did war break out in Europe? Easy. We're over halfway done. Oh my gosh, I can even ask you question number 4. How did the British win the Battle of Britain? Wow. Quick, just like that. All right. Oh, at the end of the Battle of Britain, this is a great quote from the leader Churchill. I should have talked about Churchill before this. Prime Minister of Great Britain during the World War II. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The so many are the British people, and the so few are the people in the Royal Air Force who protected them during the Battle of Britain. All right. Before I go on and talk about Roosevelt, I'm going to talk just a little bit more about that horribleness of Hitler and the Holocaust. Hitler had shown himself to be very rabidly anti-Semitic. And it was evident very clearly and laid out in his autobiography and his idea of the world, Mein Kampf, which he had written in prison before he had ever taken power. But when he took power, he put those anti-Jewish, that anti-Jewish bias, racism, out with his policies. And he first did things like take away citizenship of all German Jews. He barred them from professional jobs. He barred them from being public officials, that is, being part of the government. He banned marriages between Jews and non-Jews. What else did he do before he started doing really even worse stuff? He barred them from having any businesses. So basically, he reduced them to not really even having any sort of jobs or having any status in German society whatsoever. And of course, he was trying to encourage them to leave, and many did try to leave. But there were problems in leaving because many countries had immigration laws that wouldn't allow the easy immigration of a massive amount of people. Nowhere is this more true than in the U.S., where we had very strict immigration laws. And if we could, hindsight is 20/20, as they say. If we could have only known what tragedy would befall the Jews of Europe, and especially of Germany, but of Poland and other countries as well, how our immigration policies, I hope, would have been changed. No better example of that was in the ship, the St. Louis, which was trying to dock somewhere in the Western Hemisphere, first in Cuba and then off the coast of Florida, and finally it returned with 930 Jews whose fate I don't know whether anyone has determined, but I'm sure a good number of them died in the Holocaust. Anyway, Hitler's policy becomes even more violent with the event called Kristallnacht, the night of shattering glass, when his stormtroopers basically went through and raided synagogues and Jewish businesses and Jewish homes. And that was really when the outright war against Jews began. Let me go back to Jews and why they didn't leave. Obviously, they tried to leave, but you got to realize also that that many of these German Jews identified as much with being German as being Jewish. Germany was their home. German was their language, and just because right now they were experiencing discrimination didn't mean that the next day and the next year or the next leader wouldn't bring back about normalcy. So there might have been an idealism that, and certainly no inkling of the horrible tragedy that would befall so many of them. But after Kristallnacht, realized that that Hitler really wanted to rid Germany of all Jews. Um, um, and it wasn't until 1942, and we're jumping ahead, is when the so-called final solution, which is a real euphemism for um, the terrible decision of how to kill all the Jews that were now in being rounded up by the Germans, and that final solution um, was to kill them all. And it was just a matter of deciding how to go about doing it. They had thought about just lining them up and shooting them all in open graves and whatnot, but instead they sent them to concentration camps, many of which had already existed for political dissidents and political enemies, but now primarily were where Jews were sent by the train car load. And there were concentration camps and extermination camps, and some were both concentration and extermination camps, and some were just concentration camps. Concentration camps where people went to labor, and most of whom would die of starvation and of being overworked. And then if you were a woman, an elderly, an infirm, or a child, they would generally send you directly to be exterminated. Anyway, the final toll was that over 6 million Jews in Europe were killed by Hitler in his final solution. And that's over 2/3 of the total Jewish population of Europe at the time. Just a tremendously horrible event in history. Okay, and that leads us to number 5. That is such a hard thing to even talk about. I can't imagine living through it. Number 5. Why didn't more Jews leave Germany? Give me a reason, or maybe 2. Why didn't more Jews leave Germany during the 1930s when they saw these policies that were against them? Okay. Back to the U.S. FDR really wanted to help the Allies badly, but he couldn't because he was strapped and restricted by the neutrality laws. But he did actually see some loopholes and take advantage of them. It said that the United States could not sell arms and armaments to nations at war, but it didn't say he couldn't give them away. So he basically gave them, that is England, destroyers and other armaments in return for bases in the Western Hemisphere that were held by the British. I should say that in 1940, in the 1940 election, both FDR, the Democratic candidate, and running now for an unprecedented third time, and Wendell Willkie both took the same basic sort of middle line position. They wanted to stay involved. They wanted to be of help to the Allies, but they definitely wanted the United States to stay out of the war. Soon after FDR won the election in a landslide for an unprecedented third term, he went against George Washington's precedent of just serving for 2 terms. He basically got the Lend-Lease Act passed. Congress basically allowed nations, especially Britain, to either borrow arms and armaments to be returned after the war, or they could rent them. They could rent them and then return them, or pay for them after the war was over. And they lent. The United States lent basically $40 billion worth of arms and armaments, primarily to Great Britain, but also, interestingly enough, to Russia, whom you think would be an opponent of ours, but actually was, once Hitler tried to attack them, the enemy of our enemy is our friend in this case. And so Russia became an ally, trying to defeat Hitler as well. Also, FDR put in something called the Hemispheric Defense Protection, which was, he basically said, okay, our hemisphere includes, the Western Hemisphere includes at least half of the Atlantic Ocean, so that being Western Hemispheric territory, we have the right to patrol ships that are anywhere in the Western Atlantic, and we can patrol them and use radar on them and communicate to anyone else about anyone else's whereabouts in that region or from that vantage point. And we detected a lot of U-boats and notified especially England of their whereabouts. Of course, one of the things that brought us very close to the war was when the Germans fired upon some of our ships, and unilaterally, FDR made the policy of shoot upon sight of any German U-boat. So we were getting closer and closer to war, but it was just sort of a tense standoff with Germany at the time. Of course, all we needed then was for the unlikely attack at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese to bring us straight into the war. We did not know that we were going to be attacked there. Yes, we had received some intelligence that Japan was going to attack some military installation and that it was a U.S. installation, but no one thought that Hawaii was close enough for them to attack. But on December 7th, 1941, that's exactly what the Japanese did. They attacked Pearl Harbor, and the next day, the United States entered the war. We had no further reason because our territory, the United States, had been attacked by a foreign nation. We declared war on Japan, Germany declared war on us, and we declared war on Germany. That might have been a real misstep of Adolf Hitler's because he underestimated the strength, the power, and the will of the United States. The only other country who he had underestimated was Great Britain, but now he underestimated the force of the United States as well. And he would eventually feel the heat of that. Anything else? I guess not, except for one more question. And that is, name two things that FDR did to involve the U.S. in the war prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. That's it. Okay? And that's a nice brief 30-minute lecture. Actually, less than that. I left out a lot, but short and sweet. Okay. Submit those Google Docs to me, and if you have any questions, email me, and have a great week. Take care.